I don't know if you have some nice memories of good stories in your past. I remember times when I read fairy tales. We had a big book of fairy tales, and I liked reading those. When I was a kid, a small child, 6 or 7 years old. How do they always begin? Once upon a time. And then they usually finish, don't they, with, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, this book of Ruth, it's a brilliant short story. And it goes along those lines. And obviously we're not going to look at it all this morning. We're at the once upon a time stage in chapter 1. But in its 4 chapters, we have a story that literally is shining out like a jewel in the middle of the dark days of Old Testament Israel's history. We know from the previous book, the book of Judges, that Israel was in a complete mess at this time. We see that in the last verse in the book of Judges, which you can see, verse 25 of chapter 21 of Judges. It says, "In those days Israel had no king." Okay, disorder. "And everyone did as he saw fit." Okay, amorality, immorality, disorder, ignoring the covenant God who had brought them out of Egypt, resulting in some grim scenes, especially if you take the trouble to read Judges chapter 19. We see a culture, we see a society not dissimilar to our post-Christian society that we see in the West today. You see, Israel was disobedient. It had been disobedient to the covenant God that had brought them through Moses into the land. And God was now judging them as a nation as they turned their back on him. Yet it's in the middle of these dark days of Old Testament Israel that the story of Ruth emerges. God was judging his ancient people, yet he still loved his people, and it's seen not least in this particular woman, Naomi. And so chapter 1 is focused on this aging woman, Naomi, a lonely lady in a foreign land of Moab, with no family to care for her, just her daughters-in-law. And Naomi's plight is a reminder, of course, to the Naomis of today, and that can be men or women, boys or girls, those who maybe feel distressed this morning, those who are wondering why God has caused such hardship in their lives. Well, what we see in this story of Ruth is that God cares about our distress. He cares about our suffering, even as he's judging a nation. But the deeper point to this story of Ruth then is how we understand the same God that we can follow today. Where is Christ, who's now revealed to us as the living God in our story, in our days? How does it help us, this book of Ruth, as the Lord's people today? After all, the Old Testament scriptures are chiefly, this story is chiefly for the strengthening of the church today. Remember what Paul writes, the apostle, in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11, as he refers to the Old Testament, to all of the writings of the Old Testament, he writes, "These things happened to them," like Naomi, "as examples, and were written as a warning for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come." And so the gospel and the Spirit of Jesus with us should be our guide in interpreting this story. And so this morning, taking all of this into account, we're looking at 2 aspects in this chapter over the next few minutes. 3 teary travelers. We're introduced, aren't we, in the first part of this chapter? If you see in verse 7, we're introduced to this road journey. And it's a road journey with Naomi and her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and the men in their family have died. Naomi's husband Elimelech and Orpah and Ruth's husbands, Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, are no more. And in their desperation, really hunger, drives them to take this long road back to the land of Judah, because they read, don't they? We read in verse 6 that they hear that there's now food back in the town of Bethlehem, the house of bread, where they left. But I don't want you to underestimate the sadness of their plight. This is a tear-filled journey. 3 women crying their eyes out in grief over the loss of their husbands and their situation in life. They're facing this prospect now of separation from each other, as Naomi tells them to go back to their families in Moab. And listen, maybe the more macho of men this morning may be quietly rolling their eyes at the scene of 3 women bawling their eyes out in public. But I think I'd be crying with them if I'd experienced the same level of loss that they had. Those last few years in Moab had been years of hardship, loss of their husbands, bad decisions, poverty born from Elimelech and Naomi's bad decisions, Mahlon and Chilion's disobedience to a covenant God, marrying Moabite women. God had warned Israel that if they disobeyed his laws, they would be subject to his punishment. And God's judgment on his people in the book of Judges is clear. And now famine has come. As God had promised, this would be part of his judgment against his people if they disobeyed his covenant. And yet in that huge macro or big statement of how God deals with his people in the Old Testament, we see this story. God is offering forgiveness and grace to these obscure women. If his covenant people would only turn back to them, they would know God's blessing as well. And so it's into these huge truths of who God is and how he called his people to live for him that we're introduced then to this family of Elimelech at the beginning of the chapter. See verses 1 and 2. Elimelech means the Lord is king, which is kind of ironic, because as we read about Elimelech and what he decided to do due to famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread that is, he moves his family to Moab. And so rather than living by faith in Jehovah as his God, his provider, Elimelech reckoned he knew better. And so all of those self-sufficient decisions resulted in Naomi's position in verse 13. You see there. The Lord's hand, she says, has gone out against me. Naomi knew, you see, that she was living with these decades-long decisions. This consequence of bad decisions made with her husband, contrary to God's covenant with them as his people. And so she's reflecting on this in her tears. We made bad decisions. And now here we are in this awful mess. But in the middle of all of that, in verse 6, we see that God was also exercising his mercy, even as his people were so far from him in those days. Naomi hears in their hardship in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people in Bethlehem by providing food for them. And so Naomi decides she's going to go back to her home, from which she and Elimelech and her 2 boys should have always been. And so she stands now on this road between Moab and Bethlehem, and she tells her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law through tears that they're to go back where they could find refuge and food amongst their own, as widows in their own Moabite towns. And so it left Orpah and Ruth with a huge decision. A huge decision. You see, the choice was either God, with uncertainty and a degree of poverty in Bethlehem, but the promise of some food, or refuge if they go back to their families in Moab, but they would be going back to idolatry. They wouldn't be able and free to worship the God of Israel. And so we read in verse 14 that Orpah made that decision. She went back to Moab. She went away from God, whereas Ruth refuses to go back. Verses 16 to 18. Even as Naomi urges her, would you ever go? I can't help you. I'm in tears. I'm a mess. I'm an elderly woman. Don't stick with me. Go back to your family. And even in that, do you see the words of Ruth in verse 16? No! Don't urge me to leave. Don't urge me to turn my back on you, Naomi. I'm going to stick with you. You see, Ruth, as a Moabite worshipper of idols, had clearly become a worshipper of the living God. I can't go back, she says to her mother-in-law. I'm no longer what I once was. I'm no longer trusting in the idols of my sister-in-law. Where you go, mother-in-law, I'm going to go. Where you stay, I'll stay. And what's more, your people are my people because your God is my God. What a statement of saving faith. Staring at the face of poverty, the prospect of material comfort in Moab, Ruth determines to trust in the God of Israel, her creator, her sustainer. Do you? Are you trusting in your Creator this morning? Are you trusting in the one who you can know personally now through the work of Christ on the cross? Or are you like Orpah, deciding, I'm going to hedge my bets. I'm going to go back to the familiar, because I know that, and it provides me with some kind of comfort. I don't need God. Doesn't matter what my parents say. Doesn't matter what Andy says at the front. I'm going to go the route of familiarity because I want to be in control of my life. Friend, you need to resolve, like Ruth did, to live for Christ, even as that means uncertainty. It may mean hardship, especially when things look much more lucrative at the other end of the road of your decision. Jesus says in Matthew 7 and verses 13 to 14, enter through the narrow gate, does he not? For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many, many enter it. All of your friends and peers maybe are on that road to destruction as you come to this church and you're being introduced to the possibility of the narrow gate through the risen Jesus. Small is the gate, says Jesus, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Friends, Ruth enters the narrow gate. She pursues God on God's terms. Is that your priority in your life today? Or are you all just hung up with how your life wants to be, how you want to chart it out on your terms? Are you Orpah? Or are you Ruth? You see, God always exercises his master plan for this world through people like Ruth. Ruth reminds us as a Moabite, as a so-called foreigner in the Old Testament, reminds us of God's plan all along that we read at the end of the Bible in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9. After this I looked, John observes, as he writes Revelation. He looks, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, every tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And so, rewinding back from the end of history in Revelation to this story of Ruth, unbelieving Orpah goes back to the land of idols. A place where Elimelech and Naomi shouldn't have gone to in the first place with their sons. But now Ruth, this Moabite woman, she sticks with Naomi because she is sticking with the one true God. And so the decision's made, and as we go on in chapter 1, we move on from 3 teary women to 2 weary women, as they continue their journey then to the town of Bethlehem. And in verse 19, we have this description then of the arrival of Naomi and Ruth back into Judah. Have a look in verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Can you imagine that experience for Naomi? Maybe Naomi was hoping that she could sneak back into her hometown. Maybe she was hoping for a low-key entrance back. But we're told that on their arrival into Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred. Now, some of us here live in Balnamallard. Some of us live in rural areas. But I think we can understand what's happening here compared to city dwellers in our day and age. We live, don't we, in a small populated area. We maybe know a lot of people in our community, and that's what the experience was for Naomi as she came back to her hometown. Even after living a few months in a small town and village, we know that people can begin to know our business, and perhaps we don't like that. But that's what happens here for Naomi. They come into Bethlehem, and suddenly the place is buzzing, perhaps because there wasn't much to buzz about. And so here's Naomi turning up again, and so there's a chatter about Naomi, and that she's the shadow of her former self, that she is. And the people are saying to one another, "Guess what? What? Did you hear? Naomi's back." Really? Oh, I thought she'd moved to Moab years ago. No. Mary told me that she saw her shuffling along the main street. Yes, definitely her. Funny, I didn't think that was her. She's a lot smaller, and she's kind of stooped too. Looked a bit depressed, if you ask me. Yeah, it looks like life hasn't been easy for her. It hasn't been going well. Well, there they were. Didn't they all head off? Elimelech dragged them all off, to seek their fortune. And here she is back amongst us again. The women's chins were wagging. Gossiping was taking place in hushed tones. The spectacle of Naomi's return was filling their conversation. Where's Elimelech? Oh, she had a husband, didn't she? Where are her sons? Who's that foreign-looking girl with her? And then one of them has the courage to approach Naomi. "Is that you, Naomi?" And you see Naomi's response in verse 20. Talk about a greeting. Do you see it? "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara." This is a embittered woman. Naomi, as I told you, means pleasant. But Naomi now wants to be called Mara because it means bitter. "Yeah, I'm back, but I don't match my name anymore," she says. "Life's been so hard. I feel so bitter that I can't stand being called pleasant." What a weird reunion Naomi goes through. But we can understand Naomi, can't we? And in some ways, I find her quite an attractive personality. And I wish that maybe we were a bit more like that in the life of the church, so we knew exactly where each other is at. She's honest, isn't she? She could have, put on the airs and graces and tried to straighten her back a bit and wipe away the tears and appear all stoic, as we tend to do in our culture, don't we? But she's as straight as they come. And that's why I like her. She says it like it is. It's very honest, don't you think? And maybe we lack honesty in the life of the church at times, which is why we're not as close as we can be, which is why we don't bother with home groups, because we're afraid of being too honest in the life of the church. We see the same honesty back in verse 13 of chapter 1, when Naomi tried to stop Orpah and Ruth from coming with her, all because Naomi knew the Lord's hand. This is interesting. Her bitterness, she knew where it was coming from. She knew that the Lord's hand, Yahweh's hand, had gone out against her. You see, Naomi's emotions here remind me that life has huge challenges attached to it. It's always the case. And it's not that we're miserable if we're honest about that at times, that life can be difficult and can appear unfair. She knew that the living God, however, could say that she knew that the God was against her. You know, I have a loved one who says they're not a Christian because God didn't answer their prayer. That was the summation of his reason as to why he's atheistic. And I think it's really important for us to understand and see Naomi's position here. She was not atheistic, and yet life was heavily stacked against her. And friend, maybe you're not a Christian here this morning, and you stick with the line, well, God didn't answer my prayer, and my life's hard, therefore God mustn't exist. Take a leaf out of Naomi's book. Her life was hard, but she knew that God was in it all, and she was still relating to him, even in her bitterness. Look at verse 21. I went away full, so she went with her husband full from Bethlehem, but the Lord has brought me back to Bethlehem empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. You see, it's crystal clear in Naomi's mind. I had a husband. I had children. I had prospects. I had hopes and dreams. I went away full of that, and now I'm back under God and empty. And in the mess of the humdrum and disappointment of life, I want you to notice Naomi's faith. Even in the midst of bitterness, she knew that God was there. She didn't understand fully what had happened, although she was conscious that the family had been covenant breakers. She knew it was related to that. He had allowed these things to happen to her. Indeed, he'd allowed these things to happen to the nation of Israel at that time because of their disobedience. But here's the dilemma here for Naomi as one conscious of God in her life. What was she to do with all this pain and bitterness that she experienced and felt? I've lost my 2 boys. I've lost my husband. We made a mess of things. And the Almighty has brought this misfortune upon me. So by faith, even as my heart aches, even as I am in bitterness, I have to leave all of this with him. He's done this. I don't know why, but I believe in him. Friend, is that your experience? Is that your approach to the hardship in life? Some of us here are impacted by things that are affecting our lives, that can affect our moods, and before we know it, we can find ourselves isolated, and then we're beginning to wonder, is God there at all? And here's Naomi in the midst of profound grief and loss, but she's still relating to God in her sadness. And that is such an important principle, especially if we profess faith. But as we understand, as those who do not understand who God is, the character of God, that God can allow things that happen to people, whether they're in the household of faith or not. But either way, they're there to teach us. Those things are there to teach us, to bring us into a closer, vital walk with our God. Naomi understood who God was. And even in the pain of her loss, she acknowledged his presence in her life. Do you understand who God is? Do you understand that even in the midst of pain, that you can still understand this, that whilst we were sinners, Christ died for us? The hardest thing can happen to us in this life, and yet God has resolved to provide for the deepest need in our life, forgiveness and eternal life. Do we forget that when bad things happen? Because if you do, you'll question if he actually exists or cares for you, rather than you acknowledging that he does care for you, and you can refer to him and plead with him for help as you navigate through the difficult times. I mean, who are you going to cling to when disaster hits? Naomi still believed. Even in her heartache, she lived under the direction, bitter or not, of an almighty God who knows and sees everything. And this is the thing that kind of can irritate as well. That, as Christians, we can be in a bad mood. And we can maybe share our frustrations with others and be honest with others in the church. We don't have to have this thin veneer of, how's it going? Everything good? Yeah, everything's fine. And then going home in the car in a miserable state, giving out to miserable kids. We don't need to act like that. We can be honest and realize our lot under God's grace. Verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And so the narrator now comes back. The dialogue has finished. And I want you to notice how this book, or how this chapter is bookended. See in verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine." Oh dear, bad news, distress, tears. And then you go to verse 22. The decision is made, first of all, for them to travel from Bethlehem to Moab all those years ago. Then in verse 22, we read that they're traveling back from Moab to Bethlehem. And, optimistic statement, the harvest was beginning. It's beautifully written. It's a lovely story. And they're going back then to the house of bread, which is what Bethlehem means. The very place Elimelech ran away from has got bread in it again. And that verse 22 then is leaving us with this sense that even in the worst of times, and in this case for Naomi, God is at work on behalf of his people. And in fact, we can see, according to Naomi's experience in this story, even in the worst of times, God's plan for us is always for the better. The story of Ruth then begins with this dark chapter. A lot of it has, as a consequence of the disobedience of Naomi's family. But God is doing something better, and that is what verse 22 is preparing us for. It's bringing us from famine to harvest, from poverty to plenty. It reminds us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Alistair Begg writes, "When God is at work, even hopelessness may be the doorway to fresh starts and new opportunities." When God is at work, even hopelessness may be the doorway to fresh starts and new opportunities. Friends, from famines to fields of harvest. When God is with his people, even as we're honest with each other and feel kind of frustrated and embittered and hopeless, that can be the doorway, the entrance to a vast new landscape of fresh starts and new possibilities. He is always with us. And maybe you're here this morning on a bit of a downer. And you think, like I can think sometimes, that God is only in the dramatic, only in the well-entertained aspects of church events, only in the well-resourced, only in the humanly attractive. And so we end up in a place of despondency and disappointment like Naomi. But friends, God is always with you. He is always with his people. And so even our tears can be a good thing for us to cry out to the Lord and to experience answered prayer as he leads us to better days ahead. I want to conclude with James chapter 4, verses 8 and 10. It says, "Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Yeah, do it. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. If you know the Lord Jesus Christ this morning, God is keeping you. And he is bringing you, if he is, through dark days for his purpose, as he also brings you into his wonderful light. Amen. We're going to sing before we gather around the table together.